author of The Radical Mind, The Origins of Right-Wing Catholic and Protestant Coalition Building, and co-editor of Male Supremacy in the United States, From Patriarchal Traditionalism to Misogynist Insults and Alt-Right. Well, as a male supremacist, I think that would be interesting. Okay. And today she will be talking about Christian nationalist ideologies and aspirations. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for coming out. It is so cold out there. Definitely not equipped for this. Try again. Okay. I was going to say I'm not equipped for this kind of weather. Originally from California, I tried to live in Minneapolis at one point and just couldn't do it. The first time my eyelashes froze. This is not for me. So thank you so much for being here. We'll just get right into it. So thank you for the really nice introduction, Phil. As you said, my book is called The Radical Mind, The Origins of Right-Wing Catholic and Protestant Coalition Building. Decided not to just talk to you about my book because if you want to hear about it, there's a video online from UC Berkeley, and rather than give you the same talk, I thought I'd do something a little different, do something new, and bring it a little bit more into the present. Because my research focuses in the book on the 1970s. I started from 1965 to 1985, but most of it centered in the 1970s. And more recently, I've been doing work on contemporary Christian right movements and groups. That is the Patriot Church in Tennessee, which I visited 2 summers ago. That is the library at Notre Dame University with what is famously referred to as Touchdown Jesus. That's what they call it. Because from the stadium you can see the library building and the motif. So my work now is looking very much at still thinking about the Catholic right, but also thinking about Protestant right-wing movements and trying to conceptualize what type of future it is they are working to bring about. So we will hopefully get to that at the end and gesture to that, and a little bit about the Trump administration and Project 2025 along the way. So there are 2 central questions that most of my work is invested in trying to tease apart. And the first is, what are the ideological commitments that underpin the politics of the Christian right? And then what kind of world are they trying to bring about? And I want to be very clear. I know everyone in this room will already know this, but when I'm talking about the Christian right, I'm talking about people who have right-wing political attachments as well as conservative religious beliefs, right? And those 2 things fuse for many people. So the core ideological commitments within the Christian right, the center is Christian supremacy, which we often hear described as Christian nationalism. And we'll come to that in a second. And then these sort of 3 interlocking, overlapping ideologies of white supremacy, antisemitism, and male supremacy. So some quick definitions of these ideologies. The first is Christian nationalism. And the sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry define it as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. And Philip Gorski very importantly reminds us that for in America, religious nationalism has always been entangled with white supremacism. It has always been white Christian nationalism. And so these 2 things are really inseparable from one another. Now, often what this looks like is, in the words of Pastor Ken Peters from the Patriot Church, this idea that the United States is a nation blessed by God, right? So Peters asked his congregation, how could an empire rise without God's hand being upon it? And his answer was, it was a move sort of gentler version of Christian nationalism, even though Ken Peters is far from gentle. But this is the version that is fairly common, fairly widely spread. We'll get to some of his other articulations later. But when we are thinking about Christian nationalism as a political phenomenon and a social phenomenon, we often rely on this set of survey questions from PRRI, and they identify this sort of scale of Christian nationalism was developed in relation to Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead's work on Christian nationalism, and they identify these sort of 5 key statements. The first is God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The second is U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. The third is being Christian is an important part of being truly American. Fourth, if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. And the fifth, U.S. law should be based on Christian values. They then classify people depending on their agreement, their level of agreement with these statements, as adherents, where they completely agree on nearly all 5 questions, sympathizers, where they agree but are less likely to do so completely, skeptics who disagree but do not completely reject, and then rejectors who absolutely disagree with all 5 statements. So what does the country look like? Well, it looks like about 10% are in complete agreement with those 5 statements, right? They are what we would call adherents. 20% are sympathizers, 37% skeptics, 29% rejectors, and 4% are sort of unknowns. Now, among those, we can look at the partisan breakdown and the media landscape breakdown, and you're going to see a lot of congruence between these 2 things. But most of our Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers are found within the Republican Party, where combined, it's a little over 50% of those who are Republican would be classified as also Christian nationalist. If we look at Democrats, it's only 16%, and independents, 22-ish. And then, of course, if we look at where people are getting their media for Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers, 66% who watch far-right news are going to fall into that group. And far-right news would be Newsmax, OAN, sort of beyond Fox News. A couple of years ago, my flight was delayed. This was during COVID, and someone wouldn't wear their mask, and so we had to be diverted to Dallas in order for the person to be removed from the plane. And then I had close to 10 hours in Dallas, and discovered that every television was showing OAN. At which point I left the airport. I'm gonna go to the grassy knoll. Go hang out, go to a museum. But this is some pretty interesting data that we have just to objectively sort of map out where Christian nationalist views are, where they're being reinforced, and where people are finding a home that articulates their worldview. Now, perhaps even more interesting is when we look at religious tradition and Christian nationalism. So for white evangelical Protestants, we're going to be at about 65% Christian nationalist. And interestingly, the one that always gets the most attention is Black Protestants at about 44%. And there's a sort of question that doesn't get probed at in the data we have of how people are, I'm going to go back for a second, how people interpret the meaning of each of these statements. And so scholars of the Christian right have a hunch, although we have not been able to show it in the data, that Black Protestants interpret these statements with a different valence than do white evangelical Protestants. What is also interesting to note is that down here, we can see that about 14-ish, no,
8% of Muslims also would ascribe to these values. And this is something that is interesting where, for some people, religiosity correlates to Christian nationalism because of belief that there should be a relationship between religion and the state. And so the sort of historical prevalence and predominance of Christianity in the United States is then seen as a justification for it being a part of government. Also important to note, who believes that God ordained Trump to be the winner of the 2024 election? And here we have a high percentage of our Christian nationalists think that God has ordained Trump, which is another interesting thing when we think about how it is that perhaps the Trump administration is behaving in ways that violates principles of the Christian faith and yet retains such high levels of support from right-wing white evangelicals. All right, so I'm coming back to Pastor Ken Peters. And here we see an articulation of Christian nationalism that begins to move us away from the sort of America was founded as a Christian country, and it pushes us to think about what that might mean in the present. In a sermon, Peters said, "We have a constitution that is brilliant and based on self-governance. We the people, being the ruling party, even though we don't feel like it now, and I think it's true that the swamp has kind of gripped power," this is 2024 that he is saying this, "we plan on ending that soon in Jesus' name. But because we the people are supposed to rule in a constitutional republic, it is essential that the people are good, because we the people rule. So we the people must be good. And when the people cease to be good, our good constitution cannot forever withstand that evil. The American people, I'm afraid, are losing their goodness." And we will come back to this in thinking about how these ideologies of white supremacism, male supremacism, and anti-Semitism come into play when defining what goodness is and who the American people should be. So on to male supremacy. The Southern Poverty Law Center defines it as a unified principle of an organized extremist movement and an ideology that is deeply embedded in American society. And in the introduction to our edited volume, my co-authors and I define it as a male supremacist system as a cultural, political, economic, and social system in which cisgender men disproportionately control status, power, and resources, and women, trans men, and non-binary people are subordinated. Where we see this emerge on the Christian right is often through the adoption of beliefs that we would call patriarchal traditionalists, and Bartowski writes, "Commentators who embrace a patriarchal family structure construe several key biblical passages as advocating husband headship and wifely submission in the home. Focusing upon the first of these passages, many of these commentators frequently remind wives that submission to their husbands serves as an indicator of their commitment to Jesus Christ, for whom their husbands are serving as a divinely appointed proxy." This, of course, is a belief that we have seen in many different places. If anyone remembers when Michelle Bachmann was running for the Republican presidential nomination, there were newspaper article after newspaper article and the cover of Time magazine asking whether a submissive wife could be a political leader. More recently, we saw Charlie Kirk speaking to an audience of young college-age women and telling them that they could go to college and get a degree as long as they remembered that they should be looking for a husband and that they would find true fulfillment in being a wife and mother. I have here some of the scripture that gets used to justify patriarchal traditionalist beliefs, and of course we know, right, that it can be interpreted in different ways and it can be used for different purposes. The one that is most commonly cited is this last: "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." In my work thinking about the origins of the Christian right in the 1970s and 1980s, and I realize I'm going to put a little asterisk there, right? Origins of the contemporary Christian right. certainly we could go back further in history and find other mobilizations of the Christian right, but contemporary Christian right. What I find is certainly actors like Paul Weyrich, who is a conservative Catholic activist, center the idea of the family in order to advance their political mission, and think of the family as a sort of framework for modeling hierarchical obedience and submission, right? So Weyrich would frequently say that we need to model politics on the family, which is modeled on the church, and we need to submit in a similar way. Peters, when I interviewed him, said, I do believe that there's something special about male leadership, just because God designed men to be as the head, and that he designed us to protect the women and children. So there's a protection aspect that men have. Women are more nurturing, and they will defend their children. I was really pushing Peters when I interviewed him to explain to me why he and members of his congregants had suggested that we should repeal the 14th Amendment and that there should not be any anti-discrimination law. And I said, well, how about for women in the workplace? And he said, well, I think you'd be stupid if you discriminated against women, but of course you should be allowed to. So here we get support for patriarchy amongst Christian nationalist groups. Again, this is all coming from PRRI. And one of the statements that they asked about was society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. And that gets 72% of adherents agree with that statement. 63% of sympathizers agree with it. This argument has really become quite mainstream. If any of you maybe caught the New York Times kerfuffle towards the end of 2025 when they published an article with the title, Have Women Ruined the Workplace? And then about 20 minutes later changed the title to Has Feminism Ruined the Workplace? And then about 20 minutes after that changed it again because the immediate response was one of outrage. But the New York Times has platformed this idea that feminism or women's sort of full representation in the workforce has somehow contributed to the decline of the economy, the decline of society. And then the second statement, society is better off when men and women stick to the jobs and tasks they are naturally suited for. 61% of Christian nationalist adherents agree with that, 54% of the sympathizers. Now, where we're seeing this manifest in our current political climate can be seen in J.D. Vance's statement in 2021 when he said, let's give votes to all children in this country, but let's give control over those votes to the parents of those children. When you go to the polls in this country as a parent, you should have more power. You should have more of an ability to speak your voice in our democratic republic than people who don't have kids. Let's face the consequences and the reality. If you don't have as much of an investment in the future of this country, maybe you shouldn't get nearly the same voice. This has extended to folks like the Christian nationalist pastor Joel Ebin, who has said that he despises democracy because it allows women to vote, and has called for the repeal of the 19th Amendment. I have a video link there. I'm not going to click on it now, but maybe the slides can be shared with folks, and if you want, you can watch Joel Ebin tell us how he thinks women shouldn't vote. There is considerable concern, right, that legislation that is pending in Congress, first the SAVE Act, which was introduced last year, and then in 2026, two new acts have been introduced, the Save America Act and the Make Elections Great Again Act. And both of these would potentially keep women from voting by requiring citizenship documentation that has a direct match on your name. And if you think about, for women when they get married, they often will change their last name, but the documents that attest to their citizenship, those being their birth certificates, are not amended. And that would prohibit you from being able to vote. So there is concern that as many as 69 million American women would be disenfranchised were this to be enacted. And here you see what the effects of that would be. So the 2020 election, if only men had voted, would have looked continuing, our next sort of ideological pillar is antisemitism, which I define in line with the Jerusalem Declaration as discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. I think there's some sort of jarring language in the next quote, and so I apologize in advance. This is from a 1979 report from Citizens for God and Country that I found doing archival research and quote in my book. And it gives voice to a sort of what we might think of as crude or crass anti-Semitism. They say we see the Jews in the IRS challenging the right of Christian schools to remain all white and continue to receive federal tax exemption. The attack on Christianity goes on, and no major Christian denomination or so-called Christian leader makes any protest. While Christianity is attacked and Christians look for someone to speak on their behalf, pictures of the smiling fools calling themselves ministers and priests appear in Jewish publications, receiving a reward from the enemies of Christ. Now, we have seen a resurgence of this sort of crude, overt anti-Semitism recently. There's an article from November 23rd, 2025 in the New York Times titled "Why Republicans Are Fighting About the Nazis." And much of this was furor around Tucker Carlson platforming the white nationalist Nick Fuentes, who is an avowed fascist. In addition to expressing admiration for Hitler and Stalin, he is identified as a Francoist. So we're seeing sort of a resurgence of this kind of anti-Semitism. We're also seeing it platformed by the Department of Homeland Security's social media. This post that they made, "American Needs You, Join ICE Now," that in and of itself is a little dodgy, but not the worst. But up here, where it says, "Which way American man," is a direct reference to an anti-Semitic text from 1979 that said that Jews were trying to undo America as a nation, were poised to take over the country, and good white men needed to rise up and fight against the Jewish menace. So that is a direct, I hesitate to even call it a dog whistle, right? It is just a direct reference to an anti-Semitic book. But we also see anti-Semitism emerge in a more subtle, more covert way through Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionists are Christians in the sense that they believe Jesus is the Messiah and the Bible the true Word of God. And they are Zionists because in the post-1967 sense, they also deny the Palestinians' right to an independent homeland. I first learned of Christian Zionism from the Left Behind series. Does anyone remember this? Very popular book series that centers around the need to defend Israel in order for it to be destroyed, in order for end times prophecy to be fulfilled. So there's a strong tradition among some evangelical Protestants to couch their support for the state of Israel in relation to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That was certainly the case for Jerry Falwell, who took tours to Israel, and here we can see Liberty students also expressing their support for Israel. It is very prevalent at the Patriot Church. You can see that Ken Peters has two flags behind him in the pulpit, and he is very much in line with the sort of end-time prophecy tradition. He said that there is an end of the end times, there's a last of the last days, and I believe that we are in it not because it's a feeling or because of the prophecies that have been fulfilled. He later said, "I cannot ever compromise on Israel. They are God's firstborn. I can't. If I end up with just me and Mama, we're going to support Israel." And then when I spoke with him, he said to me that he is afraid that, and I'm quoting, "We're going to end up, Christians like me are going to end up like the Jews in Germany at some point, because we're not going to agree with LGBTQ or legitimize it ever. I'm trying to do my part anyway, because I think if we don't push back quick, we're going to end up being the Jews, as the Jews were for Hitler. We're going to end up being that in America. This idea, right, this specter of victimhood is very, very important for helping to cultivate an identity of victimhood along the Christian right. And in my work, I adapt from a sociologist named Mitch Burbrier these sort of classifications for understanding how victimhood becomes an identity for those on the white nationalist right or for those on the Christian right. And the first sort of key aspect is that Christians are motivated by a desire to return to the status quo. Secondly, that they are victims of leftist aggression and discrimination, right? For Ken Peters, it is always the scourge of LGBTQ folks that are victimizing his congregation and victimizing him. And that this victimization leads to the violation of religious and parental rights. That they are then shamed for defending their socially conservative religious beliefs, but that if they fail to act to defend these beliefs, they face an imminent and existential threat to their survival. Now, this dovetails into much of the way in which white supremacy functions on the Christian right as also an ideology that is connected to a belief in one's own victimhood. So, drawing from Charles Mills, we can define white supremacy as a particular kind of oppressive social system, subnational or national or international, coming into existence, and a time period when which race has emerged as a significant social category and social reality. Whiteness and non-whiteness are recognized racial identities, and whites have and exert differential power in creating and controlling the evolution of the social system in question, and or in blocking changes to it that would substantially reduce their domination, whose end is originally the systemic, significant, and illicit differential advantages of all or most whites as a group with respect to non-whites as a group in various important social spheres. I should note that if we were in Florida at one of the public universities, I would be fired for reading that definition. All right, so this relates to, right, this idea that whites or Christians are a persecuted group, that they are victims, is always framed in terms of backlash, right? The left is always acting as the aggressor. For the Patriot Church, the 14th Amendment allows the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act, and these two pieces of legislation have victimized them. Right? The 14th Amendment, which allows for anti-discrimination laws to be upheld as constitutional, victimizes them. It infringes on their right to discriminate on the basis of what they hold to be their religious beliefs. And so this idea that they are the ones who are being harmed, and then they are acting in self-defense, allows them to rationalize their actions and to present them as not on the offense, right? Not advancing a particular program, but just trying to maintain the status quo. Just doing what anyone would do to protect their family, to protect their faith. So a lot of what I try to do in the work is to problematize these ideas of backlash and to get us to not uncritically accept the language that says that the right wing is always just reacting to something that has been done to it. We've seen a lot of this backlash discourse recently around transgender rights, where many pundits after the 2024 election said, well, it's because the Democratic Party supported trans votes. That's why they lost, right? This was over and over again something that we heard in the media. And I would caution us against ever accepting a version of history that says that those who seek to oppress are not the ones engaging in the discriminatory action, right? That it is instead those who are looking for the protection of the law or looking for equality and recognition who are in some way responsible for their own oppression. Where we see this on the Christian right, and on the right more broadly, is in the construction of white victims Historically, we saw this in response to desegregation in the civil rights movement, where the argument was that school integration victimized white Christian parents. More recently, we have seen it expressed through fears of the woke Marxist agenda, fears of replacement, what we call the Great Replacement Conspiracy, that holds that white Christian Americans are intentionally being genocided by immigrants, by Jews, by people of color, and that they face an imminent threat to their continued survival. Where we see this, again, right, is if we look to those who are Christian nationalists. The statement PRRI gave was generations of slavery and discrimination against Black people and Native Americans have given white people unfair economic advantages. And what we find is that almost 70% of Christian nationalist adherents disagree with that. Say that there is no longer, and it has not been, systemic racism in the United States. 66% of sympathizers also disagree with that belief. PRRI doesn't ask if they see white people as being victimized, but other social science surveys have asked that question, and what we find is that roughly the same percentage will say that they believe that white people are victims of racial and social oppression. So, back to Ken Peters. In one of his sermons, he says, "Heaven is our actual country. We are #1 citizens in heaven. I have my citizenship there. My name's written in the Lamb's Book of Life. How about yours? Is your name in the Lamb's Book of Life? That's how you get citizenship up there. And let me tell you something, there's no illegal aliens going to get in. There's a big old wall up in heaven, and you ain't getting in unless you've placed your faith in Jesus Christ." He also said, Jesus, by the way, is a national God, not a global God. Borders are so divine that they will persist in heaven. He says there's still going to be the United States up in heaven. We're going to be the Christians from the United States around the throne. We're going to be worshiping in the American section. No surprises then, that if we go back to PRI, what we will find is that those who are Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers believe that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. And a staggering 70% believe that immigrants entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country, which is language that our president has used, which is language that Hitler used to describe Jews as a poison in the body politic. So where does all of this bring us? Well, it brings us to sort of questions about what Christian nationalists are envisioning for the future. And there is a question about whether the aim is to return to the past. Big question mark there about what point in the past we would be returning to. But if that is the goal, or if there's something else happening, and instead there's a desire to sort of reconceptualize and redesign our political institutions. Now, Paul Weyrich, in the 1970s, said that the old right considered itself a dying species. They tried to keep the flag flying while they saw the ship sink. And the new right, we trust in victory. We know that we represent the wave of the future. The old right had only one defensive strategy to retain the status quo. We don't accept the status quo. We want to change it. They did not carry the battle into the streets. We do. Now this is a pretty clear articulation of a forward-looking right-wing politics, right? We are not trying to hold the line. We are moving the goalposts. We are looking to transform. And that, Weyrich so straightforwardly announced this to the world, and yet scholars of the Christian right for 4 decades insisted that the movement was not trying to be radical, that the movement was not looking to transform institutions, but rather to sort of glom on to some point in the past. Again, undefined, ill-defined. But I think we really need to take seriously that the Christian right has its eyes on the prize, and that prize looks very different from anything we have ever experienced in this country. And so then we have to ask what it is. Now, maybe the closest we would get on the Christian right to a backwards-looking future would come from someone like Pastor Ken Peters, who says that we just want to get back to a I can't even believe I have to say this, a sort of pre-Civil War constitution, right? We just need to get back prior to the Reconstruction Amendments. And if we can do that, we can create the good Americans again, right? And our constitution will work because it will be a constitution for the good Christian people. And so what that means in practice would be what we call a Herrenvolk democracy, right? Where there are democratic institutions and democratic processes, but only for those who are considered members of the citizenry. Now, in the United States, at the time of the country's founding, that's what we had, right? The right to vote was initially extended only to white Protestant landowning men who were over the age of 21. If we look to South Africa under apartheid, right, that is a Herrenvolk democracy where only white South Africans were allowed to participate in the political process and ruled over. And so there's one version of the future for Ken Peters that is a Herrenvolk democracy. Perhaps women get to vote, perhaps not, most likely not. Most likely just the head of household would be allowed to express political opinions and have them enacted. But it is still somewhat in line with the country's history and its institutions. A little bit separate from that would be our Christian Reconstructionists and Dominionists. Now, 1960s to 1980s, R.J. Rushdoony had a foundation called Chalcedon and promoted something called Christian Reconstructionism or Christian Dominionism, where really he articulated a vision for theocracy. And I remember when I was in grad school and I was sort of trying to figure out a dissertation topic, and I knew I wanted to write about the Christian right. And I went to my advisor and I said, well, I really want to write about Christian Reconstructionism. And he laughed me out of the room. He said, that is so fringe. You will never get a job. No one will ever be interested in this. You are like, turning over rocks and digging under them to find something that no one's heard of. And now, our Secretary of War, at the National Prayer Breakfast just 4 days ago, said, unlike Christ in earthly ways, our brave warriors are not called to appease the world, they must confront it. We know we fight a physical battle, but ultimately grounded, as the President said, in a spiritual battlefield. Not only are we warriors armed with the arsenal of freedom, we ultimately are armed with the arsenal of faith, and have been from the beginning. To preserve the soul of America, we must continue to wield not just the physical sword, but the sword of truth. Unafraid and unabashed in this fight, we must remember every single day, especially in this town, that all power, honor, and all glory belongs to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Christ is King, and may God bless our warriors, may God bless our great republic and these United States of America. Pete Hegseth is a member of Doug Wilson's church, Christ Church, and they are Dominionists, right? They ascribe to, they are part of a network called the New Apostolic Reformation. When I say network, it's not actually a group that you can identify, rather it is a broad sort of grouping of different people who ascribe to a similar set of beliefs. And one of the ways we often hear this described is in terms of the Seven Mountains mandate, and that God has called Christians to seize control of the Seven Mountains. And so Christians should be in charge of the media, Christians should be charge of education, Christians should be in charge of government. And this is not in the Ken Peters way of just saying, well, Christians should be the ones voting, but rather it is to say that government should be Christian government, right? We are back to theocracy. Paula White-Cain, President Trump's personal pastor, is also an affiliate of the New Apostolic Reformation and is also a dominionist. So for this kind of flank of the Christian right, the future would not just look like a herrenvolk democracy. The future would look like theocracy, right? The future would look like Christian governance. And then we have, he truthed it, right? We Truth Social, my students get really mad at me because I refer to the president's posts on Truth Social as truths. And they're always like, don't call it that. I'm like, that's what he calls it. He calls them truths. So then there's the third group in this, which is the Catholic right. And the right-wing Catholics are aiming for something I have called daddy politics, right? This idea of theocracy modeled on the hierarchy and structure of the Catholic Church, where there is absolute sovereign authority and obedience is demanded. Now, this gets its articulation most clearly from Adrian Vermeule, who is a constitutional law scholar at Harvard University. And he wrote a book called Common Good Constitutionalism that promotes an explicitly authoritarian model of sovereign power. He writes, it reads constitutional provisions to afford public authorities latitude to promote the flourishing of political communities by promoting the classical triptych of peace, justice, and abundance. States it even more bluntly, as common good constitutionalism's primary aim is to ensure that the ruler has both the authority and the duty to rule. And in this system, he argues that we do not suffer from a horror of legitimate hierarchy because we see that law can encourage those subject to the law to form desires, habits, and beliefs that better track and promote communal well-being. Adrian Vermeule has been very influential for J.D. Vance and for other members of the Trump administration in articulating the unitary executive theory that the president essentially has unchecked, uncontrolled power to oversee the executive branch, and that we should submit to the president's authority. What all of this means, or how we get about creating one of these versions, well, there's considerable fear that there is increased support for political violence. What we see is that Christian nationalists are much more supportive of resorting to violence to save the country than are those who are skeptics or rejectors. And we see an uptick down here in the skeptics and rejectors, which is concerning. But that's close to 30% of those who are adherents and 25% of those who are sympathizers say that political violence is justified. And then we have support for apocalyptic revolution and political violence. Again, these different statements. These also get us, and I'm not talking today about QAnon or other conspiracy theories, but that is part of this conversation. The statements that PRI surveyed on, where there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders, and that is a QAnon statement. And then because things have gone so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And again, we see much higher levels of support for those statements for those who are Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers than for others. I do want to try and end on something of a hopeful note. Look at us, we're doing it. There is less support now for political violence than there was, and that is good. Concerningly, though, it drops only after Trump was reelected. So there's a question mark here about whether that decreased support for political violence is a result of those who are Republican supporters of the president feeling like their man's in office
those who are Democrats have to come to select it. So that's concerning. I think that's it. And we have 15 minutes. Okay.
Could you fill us in a little bit on this Pastor Peters? I know nothing about him. He's so scary.
Yeah. So I'm happy to fill you in on Pastor Peters. He has everyone call him Pastor Ken, and so I started calling him Pastor Ken, which was very concerning for my colleagues. And they're like, no, we're not on a first name basis. So the Patriot Church, it initially was founded
supposedly progressive media or left-wing media like the New York Times and the Washington Post are also, I mean, they are centrist and they are skewing center-right as the Trump administration goes on. And so, you know, you look at the layoffs of the Washington Post last week and it's impossible to not say, oh, we are in trouble. So I think not enough is being done, but it is also that we, at some point, a consensus was reached in the country where we just shrugged. You know, Pete Hegseth leads the U.S. Armed Forces in prayers to Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is King, and we just shrugged. So not enough is my answer to what is being done.
That's observation. I was thinking about that map of the United States and heaven, and I just wonder if the property taxes are better than they are here. I think one of the stunning things about what you said is what these so-called pastors are preaching is so counter to the work of Christ. I mean, on almost every level, the exclusionary hate is so counter to even the Bible. And I just wonder, in terms of what you're seeing, do you feel this is just a fringe movement that we need to be aware of or not lose sleep over? Or do you feel it's growing? Is it growing because of who's in the White House right now?
No.
It is. I mean, if we go back to this, right, we're looking at 30% of the country that expressly supports these viewpoints. It's not French. It's not French at all. And then if you think about who actually votes, right, if we map out the demographics of the people in that 30%, they are overrepresented in people who vote, right? So certainly not French. And I think that it is, you know, when I mentioned being sort of laughed at for talking about Christian Reconstructionism 15 years ago, I think that the Academy is partly responsible for the belief that it is French. I call to task my fellow political scientists and historians and sociologists who helped cultivate the idea that it was fringe and not that it was mainstream, because it absolutely is mainstream. I want to say that, you know, if you want to see where things look different, like what's happening in Minneapolis right now, I think we cannot understand the scale of resistance and protest without thinking about the role of the mainline Lutheran Church and its dominance in Minneapolis, and that it is actually progressive Christians who are so central to resisting ICE in Minneapolis, right? So there are some models that we have of what it looks like to not do this that I think are really important, that we need to be focusing on, that we need to be lifting up as models for what it looks like to have a different interpretation of the Bible, a different approach to the gospel. Because in Minneapolis it looks very, very different on the street. In fact.
How do Christian nationalists square the circle of a leader, Donald Trump, who shows little to no Christian values, yet that's one of their tenets, one of the circles you showed. And based on your presentation, I was most concerned that J.D. Vance has much deeper ties to the Christian nationalists. And if you could speculate a little bit, if he became our president, what do you think would happen?
So the answer to the first part is when Trump first was running in 2016, and there was this question of like, is the Christian right going to get behind him? Are white evangelical Protestants going to vote for him? Because he so evidently is not a good Christian man by any stretch of the imagination, right? And the justification that I heard articulated over and over and over again was to compare Trump J.D. Vance is a much more frightening political figure. He doesn't just have deeper ties to the Christian nationalists. He has deeper ties to what we might call the techno-fascist right. You know, Peter Thiel is financially responsible for J.D. Vance's rise. And there are interesting points of convergence between the sort of techno-fascists and the Christian nationalists around things like pro-natalism, but they also have pretty divergent aims as well. But I think that, yeah, I think J.D. Vance would be much more inclined to theocracy than any potential candidate we've ever seen. I mean, I would rather have Pat Robertson as president or J.D. Vance. But yeah, I have to think that J.D. Vance is intensely unlikable, and so maybe we don't have to worry too much. But that assumes we still have free and fair elections, and I'm not betting on that anymore.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a related question. I mean, we know that Trump just uses all this Christianity stuff to support his own grasp on power. He doesn't have any religious beliefs whatsoever. Do you believe that Vance and Hegseth are sincerely religious, or do you think they're just using this to consolidate power?
I think they're very sincere in their beliefs. I think Hegseth is absolutely a believer. I think Vance is absolutely a believer. Whether what they believe is, I mean, you know, our vice president keeps getting in arguments with the Pope about Catholicism. So whether what he believes is what we would consider to be in line with the faith tradition is a whole different question. But I think that J.D. Vance believes he is a good Catholic, and he believes he is Catholic. And, you know, I think the most interesting thing that I heard is that he actually does have this quite long-standing interest in televangelists, because he modeled much of his public persona on televangelists, which would suggest that he does have a longer relationship to the Christian right than many people presume.
But that's his sense of showmanship. I mean, that's how he wins people over. It's not that I mean, is Tammy Faye Baker a sincere Christian, or is she just a great performer?
Oh, I love Tammy Faye. I'm gonna go with that and say Tammy Faye was a true Christian. She, in her later life, right, she did such incredible ministry with LGBTQ outreach, and
She
HIV
did?
AIDS.
Oh,
Yeah,
she
I'm a Tammy stan. But I don't, you know, as a scholar, we're trained to not pass judgment on anyone's faith, right? There is no, we are very careful. I am very careful to never say that is good religion or that is bad religion, or that is good theology or bad theology. I can comment on, right, Vance disagreeing with the Pope and say, well, if you ascribe to a belief system that says that the leader of the church is God's mouthpiece, then disagreeing with him suggests that maybe you're unclear on what the basic tenets of your own faith are. But I don't know what's in their hearts or in their souls. I think from my perspective, right, that they can't possibly be understanding what they're reading or understanding what they profess to understand.
What about that guy that you interviewed, the pastor? I mean, you've met him. Do you believe that he's sincere, or is he also just using?
Oh, 1,000,000% sincere. I mean, 1,000,000% sincere. And he believes he is doing the Lord's work. And that, I guess that's the thing, is that we need to, in understanding that this is 30% of the country, and taking seriously what they believe. Like, Pastor good Christians in America, right? They will be like the Jews under Hitler. And so it is absolutely sincere. And that makes it so much more powerful, right? When you see yourself under attack, when you believe what you are doing is righteous, that is when you will sacrifice your life. That is when you will fight to the death. That is when, as Pete Hegseth says, right? Like our soldiers are fighting for Jesus. You believe that, nothing will stop you. So I think they're very sincere, and that is very frightening. And again, I don't know about Trump. I mean, at this point, I think Trump believes in himself, and that might be the end of the story. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Both.
One last quick 30-second question.
Can we do both questions? And
If we can do it in 30 seconds.
How would Christian nationalism in Europe compare to the U.S. in terms of patriarchalism?
Oh, good question. And your question?
That's okay. I
Okay.
can't contain it to, I'd rather not.
We can chat after.
Okay.
It's okay. It is different, is my answer. But increasingly there are transnational ties amongst these groups, and so this version of Christian nationalism is spreading in Europe. Although it is different, and it depends on where in Europe. You look at Russia, it's going to, right, you're going to have a version of religious orthodoxy and sort of fusion with the state, but it's going to look very different than this does. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, for doing this work. It is hard work, and we're so grateful to you.
It's really my pleasure. And I will make a plug. There is a podcast. If this is new, if you're curious, if you want to learn more about this, there's a podcast called Straight White American Jesus by Bradley Onishi, and he is brilliant. He is so great, and he has lots of really smart people on his podcast to talk about Christian nationalism and to try and unpack all of this. Straight White American Jesus. It's really, yeah, he's become a good friend, and I have nothing but great things to say about his podcast as a tool and a resource for getting people exposed to